Hello and welcome back to the One Shot Show, where GMs go to level up. My name is Matt.
My name is Mock.
And I've got a bone to pick. I've got an axe to grind. I've got a bee in my bonnet about something that I like to call the realism fallacy.
Go on. It sounds like you have another trademark Matt rant bottled up and ready to go, and I'm willing to sit here silently for 15 minutes while you fill our listeners' ears with your opinions. Go on.
I'm glad that that's what you are really up for, but it's not what's happening. What's going to happen is I'm going to lay out, in my words, what I believe the realism fallacy is, and then I want to hear your thoughts on it. We're doing a role reversal. It's not a Matt rant. This is the Mock show this time. So that's right. I'm finally letting you talk. The realism fallacy. The realism fallacy, in its absolute essential terms, is I think there is often a wrong-headed strive towards increased realism, in the belief that it will make your games better. And what I think people are going for, they feel it will make their games better because what they're actually striving for isn't increased realism, it's increased immersion. And they've got the two mixed up.
Yes,
Mark.
I was just about to use the word immersion. I was sitting here, I was waiting for my chance, and you have very kindly allowed me to speak. And I think you've absolutely nailed it. Immersion is good. Realism, it's okay to a degree, depending on what kind of game you want to run. Why is this going to be an episode about immersion instead? Are we immediately going to go off topic?
Well, what I'm really keen to talk about is where the two converge, which is where the mistake gets made that the two are synonymous, and then where they diverge, and therefore where you are more interested in immersion instead of realism.
In that case, there is something we need to do right now out of the gate, and that is tell
Let's
our audience.
get naked!
If you go to our Patreon, you can see Matt taking off his sweater. What is realism? What is immersion? What's the difference, Matt?
So, look, realism is just how close do things in your not real setting, your fantasy made up setting, whether it's, high fantasy, orcs, goblins, dwarves, magic, or low fantasy, it's only people, but, it's still more or less fantasy, whether it's sci-fi or what have you. It's basically how closely do the things in that setting map one-to-one to their real-world analogs. That means a number of things. It means, how fast do horses go? Do they go the same speed as our horses, or do you have sci-fi horses that go faster because they've got 6 legs and they've been genetically engineered to be that way, right? It's basically how close do they map one-to-one to how things work in the real world. Immersion, on the other hand, is tied extremely closely to the willing suspension of disbelief. If you're not familiar with that concept, I'm sorry that your house is a rock. Mine is much nicer. But basically, the willing suspension of disbelief is basically, am I willing to agree that this thing that isn't real, that I know cerebrally isn't real, am I willing to believe temporarily that it is real for the sake of my own enjoyment?
So to take everything you just spent 5 minutes talking about and boil it down to maybe a 20-second sentence, realism is a tool that you can use to increase immersion, which is how invested the people at your table are in the game.
More or less, yeah.
Incredible. Why is that important?
The immersion or the realism? Because,
let's stick to realism.
Okay.
Why would you...
So the reason I would say realism is important, I'll actually go to the thing I just said a moment ago. Do horses move at the same speed, right? Realism makes your world easier to navigate. It makes it more intuitable. It means it's easy to figure out how things are likely going to work, It's things like, are the days the same length? It's a lot of very basic functional mechanical things that people need to have an understanding of when they sit down and play so that they can meaningfully make decisions and plan stuff. If you've been planning this whole thing about, going out after dark and robbing a mansion, and then suddenly halfway through that plan, the GM's like, oh, the sun doesn't set in this setting. When the sun sets, the second sun rises. You'd be like, well, now my whole plan doesn't work anymore, right? Now, the issue isn't that there's 2 suns in the world. There is a communication issue there. But basically, for anything that doesn't map one-to-one with reality, it has to be explicitly explained And if it isn't explicitly explained, it has to be assumed that it works, quote unquote, realistically. When people complain, oh, that's unrealistic, I find usually what they're actually saying is, I am now going to find it more difficult to intuitively navigate your world because of this reality-based rule or factor that you've introduced to the setting.
So to take that round, you spend about 5 minutes going through, and to boil it down,
I can see the clock counting
to a
up.
much
we are under the 10-minute mark, sir.
to a much shorter sentence. It'd be more like you are using realism to ground the world and help the players believe that the really fantastical sci-fi or magical elements work. They interact with it in logical ways, and they can explore this world using some rules that they are familiar with.
Yeah.
Nice. I agree. Great. That is why realism is important. I think it may have been George R.R. Martin who was talking about
Could
this.
have been Michael Moorcock. Could have been anyone.
Could have been Mark Wahlberg.
Who's
Who
to
knows? Where he said that in order for people to believe in your dragons, like your horses and your economies and your people had to feel real. Because if the basic stuff didn't work, no one's going to believe that you've got two suns and this world functions. So realism is necessary for that immersion, which is great, and for that buy-in, which is fantastic. But, Matt, what makes a game feel real? How can you generate that in your players?
Well, see, this is an interesting thing because I think we have quite different approaches to that.
We do? That's never come up before.
What? It's all one episode. I go for like absolute simulation wherever possible. That's basically how I run my worlds. My worlds feel real because the people in them feel like real people who are doing their own thing, even if, the camera doesn't have to be
Matt,
to be looking at them.
I immediately have questions. When you say absolute simulation, are you doing things like tracking every single meal every character has, every single time they need to take a leak, every single arrow, every bullet, and are you mapping out where every single NPC is going at every hour of the day?
No, and there's a very basic reason. Have you ever heard of something called ludonarrative dissonance?
Teach me about ludonarrative dissonance.
No, because I don't actually want to talk about it. I want to talk about something else that I call ludomechanical dissonance.
Go on.
So, ludo meaning, games or to play games, and mechanical meaning, the rules that govern said games. There can be a dissonance between those things, right? Essentially, there comes a point where in order for the gameplay to be, if there is such a thing as maximally enjoyable, there is going to inevitably be a tension point between that and mechanics enabling that, right? Basically, it's not fun to track every single meal and every single bowel movement, right? That's what it comes down to. That's actually not that much fun, and there's not a whole lot of gameplay in that. And it's also often not the type of game that we're interested in running. Where the whole realism fallacy thing started for me actually was in puzzles.
Okay.
Because when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons specifically and similar media, puzzles are this sort of legacy part of the format that I kind of wanted to have in my games. But I also had this extremely uber realistic simulated world, and I found it really difficult in that kind of world to have a door that happened to be locked by solving a Sudoku. Right?
It is a real shame we don't have those in real life. Yeah.
But it got to the point where I actually had to go, my players are willing to pretend that this is a reasonable thing, right? That like having to solve a Sudoku to unlock a door is something that these people are just going to have to do sometimes. No one's like, when it actually comes down to it, yeah, my players could sit there and go, why would someone make this door to, that could only be unlocked by Sudoku? That's unrealistic. But all they would be ruining is their own enjoyment, their own ability to have fun.
When your players encounter this puzzle dungeon in this otherwise subjectively very realistic world, that's an example of that ludo mechanical dissonance. They're willing to suspend their disbelief and say, I'm going to stay immersed, even as we do a magic square followed by a Sudoku, and then maybe a bit of a Wordle.
Exactly. And it's purely because the
rest of your world is real enough that they can come back to that. But how do you make that world that real for them? What tools are you using to keep them drawn in?
One of the things I use, and I'll probably want to talk about this in a whole separate episode, sometimes I will have sessions that kind of focus more on the world and the setting, in the way that, not every session has to be the party rolls into town and gets stuck into some kind of trouble. Sometimes it's just the party rolls into town and like, man, what a weird town. Like everyone in the town is like constantly looking at their own left hand while they talk, and they never learn any real detail as to why, the townsfolk, there's clearly something going on, but they're so guarded. They're like, mind your own business. We've dealt with your adventurer types before, and they just mean nothing, no kind of good. There's no problem to be solved. There's no thing that can really happen. But they walk away with this feeling that they just left this real place that exists. It existed before they got there, and it continues to exist afterwards. And as far as they're concerned, will always continue to exist, even though in reality it stopped existing as soon as I stopped describing it.
Now, my opinion of this is that if you were to run a session for me personally, and I was simply exploring a world just to see what was there inside our shared imaginations, I might get quite bored quite quickly. And I'm coming from, brace yourself, this is wild. I'm coming from a radically different direction here. Is that we've been talking so far about realism.
I don't understand that. The only way is my way, to my knowledge.
We've been talking a lot about mapping our fictional worlds to reality to help ground our players in those. But as far as I'm concerned, as long as the internal logic of your world works, do whatever the fuck you want. When you're talking about, I don't want every session to be my characters getting into shenanigans at the local town, I'm the exact opposite. Every single town my characters walk into, they are just in time for the latest drama. There are things happening all over the place. And oh my God, if only there were half a dozen well-equipped outsiders who could come in and help us solve that. And I will do that repeatedly for years to my players.
See, there's something that really interests me there that you talked about, which is internal logic. And that is the other way that you can do this, right? And again, it can actually get so heavily divorced from reality while still being immersive and mechanically satisfying while focusing on the gameplay to get past that ludo-mechanical dissonance that I was talking about. And a great example that I have in my games, I don't like the idea that you beat the final boss of a dungeon and there just happens to be piles of gold sat there, right? There are certain creatures where that makes a lot of sense. A dragon with a hoard, obviously. A lich might have a repertoire of magical artifacts. A beholder might be similar. This is, purely going in the fantasy direction. If we were doing like a cyberpunk campaign, then hey, we assassinated the CEO of a megacorp in his fancy home. We can nick all his high-tech stuff. That's a way to like get loot, get gold, get stuff. Most of the time, my players are going to be getting paid through some other means. Maybe they've been hired to go take out the bandit camp nearby rather than you kill the bandit boss and then he's just got like $300 sat around. However, I have also run games, and this isn't my usual mold, but I have run games where the way it works is outside the front of every dungeon is the same guy, and he pays you based on what happened in the dungeon. And genuinely, it got to the point where my players would want to do things like one of the pieces in there was if a player died, he could either give you a scroll to revive them or pay you out the value of the scroll. And genuinely, I had players who would go like, "Do not resuscitate." Take the payday. Like, I've come up with a disposable guy. And because I put that guy in my setting, and I didn't put too much credence on explaining it, it was sort of implied that he's probably tied to some kind of deity, like the god of adventures. But it was internally consistent, so no one thought twice about it. If anything, they started leaning on it and relying on it and making decisions based around it.
I have a top tip for any game masters out there who are putting random guys outside your dungeons or doing random shenanigans in the world. And I will often get called out by my players for things that are really pushing the boundaries of what feels realistic or makes internal sense. They will say, "Mock, why is this the way that it is?" And I have a one-word answer that covers every question. Magic.
Yeah.
I will offer no further explanation, and my players in particular have learned to simply accept that, and it's become almost a running gag across many of my tables, that sometimes when you're following the mechanics of something like Dungeons & Dragons, where you can kind of finagle mathematics and move slightly further than you normally would be able to by like cutting across a diagonal or casting a certain spell, they'll say, Mock, why does physics work that way? And I'll say, listen, magic. The world was made by magic. You are the heroes. Every time you walk into a town, you're in the exact right place where you need to be. This world is built around you. They are coming to the table already with that belief suspended, ready to play a fantastical game. And any of the realism that I need to add, your players getting tired, your players taking damage, losing and trading money, is already supported by the mechanics of the game. And that's why we're playing a shared system.
Exactly. I mean, and you've absolutely nailed the heart of that whole thing, which is the players, on a very fundamental level, want to enjoy the session. They want to enjoy the game. They show up intending on enjoying themselves, which means they've already chosen to probably suspend a significant level of disbelief, because as soon as a player calls bullshit on the realism, the only thing they ruin is their own ability to have fun, and possibly even the ability of other people to have fun. But Mark, I go a layer deeper than saying because magic.
Unbelievable!
For example, if I have, let's say, I have the players encounter a high-level NPC who does this incredible, weird, ritually spell that teleports them across a great distance in excess of what the regular stat block teleport spell could ever accomplish. If the players ever ask me, could I access that spell? I say no, because I'm the DM and I made that up and you're going to accept it because we're just here to play this game.
Matt, I have the ultimate question for you. Does realism even exist in tabletop RPGs?
The answer is yes, in a lot of systems, in varying degrees, but not in all, and you kind of have to feel it out. If you're sitting down to play D&D, and I know that we mostly talk about D&D and equivalent fantasy systems, then I think a lot of people are pretty familiar with the extent that to which realism exists in that setting, because it also has to facilitate dragons and wizards and all of that bullshit. If you're doing something like Kids on Bikes, it's often a lot more grounded. If you're doing something like Cyberpunk, it's often a lot more grounded, but for the wacky technology, but that is still following an internal logic. It's just a very different one to the Dragons and Elves and Wizards suite of internal logic. If a dragon showed up in your Cyberpunk campaign, you would find that unrealistic to the same degree that if a cyborg showed up in your D&D campaign, you would find that unrealistic.
So really, our point is just that realism is there to facilitate immersion, and you should use it to that extent, and besides that, it doesn't really matter.
Yep, and do not mistake it for immersion, whatever you do.
Cool. I feel like we're pretty much summed it up.
I feel like that's been 18 minutes. This has been the One Shot Show, and we'll see you next week. If you like what you just heard, feel free to support us on Patreon. Every little bit helps. Go to patreon.com/oneshotshow.